The arena pulsed with an electric hum, a cathedral of violence and spectacle built into the metallic skeleton of an asteroid. Thousands of alien species, some hulking, others serpentine, a few barely visible to the naked eye, filled the stands, their voices blending into a single deafening roar that vibrated through the monolithic Colosseum. At the heart of it stood a man. He was small, compared to the war beasts of Varak, fragile next to the crystalline titans of Zikon, weak compared to the bio-forged gladiators, bred for a single purpose, destruction, and yet he stood. The announcer's voice, an oscillating mix of guttural clicks and reverberating bass, rolled across the Colosseum. For the first time in the history of the Apex tournament, a human enters the final round. The crowd erupted into chaos. Jeers, laughter, incomprehensible curses in a dozen alien tongues. The very idea was absurd. Humans weren't built for this. This was the stage of the immortals, the apex of the galaxy's most ferocious species. Every champion standing in that arena had bled their way to this moment, carving a path of broken bodies and shattered dreams. And yet, the frail, insignificant human had survived. Worse, he had won. The floating hollow screens replayed the impossible. Footage from previous rounds flickered through the arena. The towering brute of the Gorathans, its four-armed swinging warhammers that could crack mountains, disarmed and dropped in a heap by a single fluid movement. The insectoid Dralath, moving, faster than the eye could track, its exoskeleton impervious to traditional strikes, folding in on itself, its body locked in a chokehold no one had seen coming. The Skellborn warlord, a master of psychic combat, its mind tendrils overwhelming. Weaker beings, left screaming as the human resisted. No, not just resisted, pushed back. And now, here he was, the last fight, the final round. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the stadium. Opposite him, standing over 10 feet tall, was the reigning champion of the Apex tournament, Varak, the Unbroken. The crowd silenced. Varak's plated armor gleamed under the Colosseum's shifting lights, his twin razors gleaming with the promise of violence. His deep-set eyes studied the human like one might observe an insect, curiosity masking the certainty of its demise. The holoscreen flashed the betting odds. Varak, the Unbroken, 99.8%. The human, 0.2%. The audience laughed, already celebrating. The inevitable. The human just smiled. He flexed his hands, rolling his shoulders, as if preparing for an afternoon spar, not a battle to the death. His voice cut through the stadium like a blade, calm, unshaken, unafraid. Let's get this over with. And as the gates slammed shut, locking them inside the arena, the laughter faded. Because for the first time, uncertainty rippled through the crowd. What if? What if the human won? What then? The Colosseum's energy shifted. The laughter had died, but in its place, something far more insidious had crept in. Doubt. For all their jeering, for all their certainty, no one could ignore the impossible fact that the human was still standing. Varak the Unbroken had fought across 100 battlefields, a walking monument to warfare, undefeated in the Apex tournament for over a decade. He had broken gladiators forged in biovats, shattered champions, raised in war rings, and crushed warlords who had conquered entire planets. And yet the man across from him, he looked relaxed, not cocky, not arrogant, just ready. The combat drones hovered overhead, their lenses flashing as they catalogued every movement, every breath, every flicker of intent between the two fighters. The Colosseum's vast energy. Barriers hummed, preventing any interference. This fight would be settled in blood and skill alone. The announcer's voice boomed once more. Final round, the last battle of the Apex tournament, the prize, the title of Apex champion, the seat of the arena's master. A murmur ran through the crowd, the reality of the stakes setting in. The kaun, apex champion, wasn't just a title. It was power, raw, undeniable. The master of the arena controlled who fought, who lived, and who earned the right to call themselves the strongest in the galaxy. And yet, here was a species no one had even considered a threat, standing at the precipice of seizing it all. Begin. The force field dropped. Varrock didn't hesitate. The giant warrior moved like a force of nature, closing the distance in a single step. His twin razors hissed through the air, their edges vibrating at ultrasonic frequencies sharp enough to slice through reinforced battle plate like wet cloth. The human barely moved. Then, a flicker of motion. Varrock's blade missed by an inch. Not because the human dodged in panic, not because he barely escaped. No, he had simply not been there when the blade arrived. The crowd gasped. Varrock's second strike came like a thunderclap, a horizontal arc that had decapitated a dozen warriors before him, but the human had already stepped into the strike zone. He moved inside the champion's reach, where no one had ever dared to go. A fist met Varrock's ribs, not a punch thrown in desperation, not an attempt to stagger. A strike, deliberate, calculated, lethal. Varrock's body shuddered. Not from pain, from shock. It had been a long, long time since he had felt something like that. The moment stretched thin. For the first time, he hesitated. For the first time, Varrock considered his opponent. The human was grinning now, his body loose, unburdened by doubt. He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his footing, not because he was uncertain, but because he was getting comfortable. And in that moment, as the champion realized he was facing something he did not understand, the fight truly began. Varrock had fought legends, torn through champions, and stood atop an empire of broken bodies. He had earned his name, the Unbroken, because no warrior had ever forced him to bend. But now, for the first time in decades, something unsettling crawled at the edges of his mind. The human wasn't just surviving. He was reading him. Varrock adjusted his stance. His twin razors flickered, shifting into a defensive formation, an instinctive move meant to force his opponent into overextending. The human didn't bite. Instead, he circled, slowly, casually, as if measuring, as if calculating. The audience's roar dulled, the Colosseum falling into an unnatural quiet. It was subtle at first, a few murmurs, an uncomfortable ripple. The silence spread, consuming the once booming cheers and jeers, replacing them with something more dangerous, doubt. The fight had not gone as expected. The human had lasted more than a few seconds. Worse, he had struck first. Varrock clenched his jaw. Enough! He lunged, a burst of impossible speed, his form a blur of silver and shadow. He struck low, forcing the human to jump. The human didn't. Jump! He twisted with the attack, allowing Varrock's own momentum to carry him forward, and in the space of a heartbeat, the human was inside his guard again. Varrock felt it. The shift, the control slipping from his fingers, and then pain, a flash of movement, a pressure against his exposed side. The human had struck him again. Not an overwhelming hit, not an all-out attack. No. Something worse, a test. Varrock staggered back, more from disbelief than from pain. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of war, refining his skills, shaping his body into a living weapon. He had anticipated raw strength. He had prepared for speed, for tenacity, for desperation. What he had not prepared for was precision. The human strikes were not wild nor reckless. They were surgical. Each movement exact, each adjustment purposeful. He was not simply fighting Varrock, he was dismantling him, and the champion wasn't the only one who had noticed. The Colosseum, once a symphony of chaos, was now a tomb of silent observers. The onlookers had expected a spectacle of dominance. They had anticipated the human's downfall, his body crushed before the might of the reigning champion. But as the fight stretched on, as the impossible kept happening, a new realization took. Oh, this wasn't a fluke, this wasn't luck, this was a problem. Varak narrowed his eyes, forcing his breathing to steady. He had been underestimating his opponent, treating him like a curiosity. That was over now. He tightened his grip on his razors. If the human wanted to prove himself, then he would bleed for it. The energy in the arena had changed. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was something else. The Colosseum, designed to be a stage for the strongest warriors in the galaxy, had seen countless battles, each more brutal than the last. But this was different. The human problem had evolved. Varak was done holding. Back with a sudden earth-shaking step he vanished. One moment he was standing, a mountain of sheer force and lethality. The next, he was upon the human, twin razors slicing toward the throat with the speed of a railgun shot, a killing strike. The human moved, not in panic, not in retreat, but in acceptance. He leaned into the attack, letting the razors pass a hair's width from his skin. His movements were impossibly fluid, as if he knew where the blades would be before they even arrived. The audience gasped. Varak snarled. This was no longer about winning. This was about breaking the human. His blades came in a flurry now, each. Strike faster, sharper, deadlier. No feints, no hesitation, only pure, relentless violence. And yet, nothing landed. The human was no longer just dodging. He was flowing, moving just enough to let the blades miss, stepping precisely where Varak didn't want him to be. It was an insult disguised as skill, a reminder that the human was not fighting for his life. He was fighting because he could. Something cracked in Varak's mind. Enough. The champion shifted his weight and slammed his foot down, causing the entire Colosseum floor to quake. Then he struck, not with his blades, but with his body. The sheer force of his charge turned him into a battering ram. No one could have dodged it, and finally, the human took the hit. The impact sent him skidding backward, boots scraping against the arena floor. He rolled, momentum carrying him several meters before he twisted mid-air and landed. On one knee, dust settled. The Colosseum exhaled. The human wiped his lip. A thin trickle of blood, the first blood drawn. Varak grinned, a deep rumbling sound that echoed through the arena. You bleed. The human lifted his head. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation, only interest. So do you. Varak frowned, and then he felt it, a sharp, aching pulse in his ribs. He looked down. A bruise. No, a wound. His armor, meant to withstand plasma fire and planetary combat, had been cracked. By him. By the human. For the first time, the great champion staggered. The audience had no words. Silence reigned over the Colosseum, heavier than steel, thicker than blood. And in that moment, something terrifying happened. For the first time in the history of the Apex tournament, someone began to cheer for the human. The cheer was small at first. A single voice lost in the vastness of the Colosseum, then another and another, until the sound, once an ocean of mockery and certainty, began to change. Varak heard it, felt it. It burned hotter than any wound. For 10 years he had stood unchallenged, unbroken, the greatest warrior in the known galaxy. His victories were never questioned, his dominance absolute. And yet in a fight where he should have already won, the balance had shifted. Not because he was losing, but because they believed the human could win. He could not allow that. Varak let out a thunderous roar, the sound rippling through the arena like a shockwave. His razors ignited, the energy within them burning hot enough to cut through a starship's hull. This time, there would be no mistakes. The human would die. Varak exploded forward. There was no hesitation, no doubt, no restraint. His entire being became momentum. Each strike fueled by years of mastery, every movement sharpened to lethal perfection. The Colosseum shook as his razors carved through the air, slicing through stone, leaving molten scars where the human had stood. Seconds before, he was faster now, more brutal, more desperate, but the human, he was calm. For every savage strike, there was an effortless counter. For every overwhelming attack, there was an answer. Not strength against strength, but something worse. Understanding Varak had been fighting to destroy. The human had been fighting to learn, and now he had learned everything. Varak saw it too late. The final shift in weight, the slightest tilt of a foot, the moment where everything he had ever known about battle turned against him. The human moved, stepping inside the strike again, but this time there was no escape. There was only the end, a single precise strike, not to kill, not to maim, but to finish. The human's palm met his chest, a soundless impact, no explosion of power, no dramatic burst of light, just finality. Varak's razors slipped from his fingers. His vision blurred. His knees hit the ground. He had lost. For the first time, he had lost. The Colosseum was silent. Not because the battle was over, but because no one, not a single soul in the galaxy, knew what happened next. The human stood over him, the weight of the moment settling between them. Then he did the unthinkable. He offered his hand, not in pity, not in mockery, but in acknowledgement. Varak, the unbroken, the apex champion of the galaxy, took it, and as the human pulled him back to his feet, the crowd erupted. The noise was deafening. A sound that had never been heard in the apex arena before. Not the cries of a fallen warrior, not the roaring of a champion's victory, but something new, something impossible. The thunder of a galaxy cheering for a human. Varak, the unbroken, had been broken, and yet, as he stood, steady only because of the man who had defeated him, there was no shame in his eyes, only acceptance. The moment stretched, history bending under its weight. The Colosseum's lights flickered, hollow screens flashing one undeniable truth. A new apex champion had been crowned, and he was human. The announcer's voice trembled, uncertain, as if the very act of speaking the words might shatter reality itself. By the laws of the apex tournament, the victor is declared. A pause. Then the declaration that changed the course of the galaxy. The human is now master of the arena. The crowd erupted, some in disbelief, some in anger, some in sheer, unfiltered awe. Because this wasn't just a tournament. This wasn't just a fight. This was a shift in power. The Apex Arena had been more than a battleground. It had been a symbol, a throne for the strongest, a seat of influence that dictated the fate of entire factions, and now, for the first time since its inception, it belonged to someone from a species that had been considered insignificant. The human exhaled, rolling, his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of destiny. He turned to Varak. "Do I make a speech or something?" Varak stared at him, then barked out a low, gravelly laugh. The first laugh of a man who had finally faced the truth. "Not yet, human." His eyes flickered toward the edge of the arena. "Not while they're watching." The human followed. His gaze, beyond the energy barriers of the Colosseum, beyond the roar of the crowd, something else was watching. The warlords, the conquerors, the kings of the galaxy. And they were not pleased. This tournament had been theirs, a way to keep the strongest within reach, to control power through battle. A human winning? That had not been part of the plan. The air shifted. Something in the Colosseum's foundation trembled, and as the human locked eyes with the unseen rulers of the galaxy, he realized something. Winning the tournament, that had been the easy part. Now, he had to survive what came next. The roar of the Colosseum was already fading, not because the crowd had lost interest. Far from it. The sheer impossibility of what had just happened still pulsed through the air like an aftershock, a wound in reality itself. A human had won the Apex tournament. A human now sat atop the arena's throne. But something else was shifting beneath the surface. Something unseen, something dangerous. The new champion, the first and only human to ever claim the title, stood at the center of it all, watching the shifting tides of power in real time. His breath was steady, his body still carried the lingering aches of battle, but his mind was already elsewhere, because Varak had been right. This victory wasn't an end, it was a beginning. The warlords, the syndicates, the hidden hands that had controlled the tournament for centuries, they were watching. They had built the Apex arena as more than a battleground. It was a lever of control, a way to test the strongest, to mold them, to own them. And now, a species they had dismissed as irrelevant had shattered the system. The Colosseum's holofeeds cut away from the arena floor, zooming in on the observers. Chambers where the true rulers of the galaxy sat cloaked in darkness, expressionless, silent, waiting. Varak, still standing beside the new champion, exhaled deeply. The fight had been his loss. But this was his warning. They will not let you keep this, human. His voice was low, nearly drowned out by the still roaring crowd. They will come, for you. The human didn't look surprised. He flexed his fingers, rolling one shoulder. Yeah? His voice was quiet, but there was no fear, only certainty. Let them try. The words should have been arrogance. They weren't, because he hadn't just won. He had learned, and they, whoever they were, would soon learn something too. This wasn't just about a tournament anymore. It was about a shift in power, a war that had already begun the moment he had stepped into the arena. And if the warlords of the galaxy thought they could simply erase his victory, make it disappear as if it had never happened, they didn't know humans very well. Because humans, they never. Stop fighting!